Professor Blight is a noted author, teacher, scholar, and public historian. At Yale University, he is a Sterling Professor of History. At Yale University, he is a Sterling Professor of History and Director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. For his latest book, the 2018 biography of Frederick Douglass, entitled Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, David earned 9 book awards, including the best of all, the Pulitzer Prize. In November 2019, David talked about this most insightful book at the Citadel Holliday Auditorium, an event open to civil students, faculty, staff, and general public. David Blight was, as always, absolutely wonderful. A remarkable thing about his Frederick Douglass book, to me, is that David spent 10 years researching and writing it. What an amazing reinforcement of the impact of work ethic. Since I first discussed our ambition to build the International African American Museum with David Blight over 10 years ago, he has been a constant source of encouragement and assistance. I asked if he would give a supportive statement that we would use in our fundraising materials. He provided the following, in quotes: "The International African American Museum to be built at Gadsden's Wharf is one of the most important commemorative projects in American history," end quotes. Since then, we have raised over $100 million. As you know from this week's reading, today is by no means David Blight's first visit to Hampton Park. His vast knowledge of the history of slavery and abolition and Charleston's roles in these histories is unrivaled. I'm sure you will find his visit today most memorable. It is my pleasure to introduce you to a distinguished historian and one of the most genuinely nice and humble people you'll ever meet, David Blight.
Well, thank you, Joe. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can everybody hear me okay? Can I get a thumbs up from somebody on that? Or can I be heard properly by everyone?
I'm getting good audio and I see some thumbs here.
All right, terrific.
I think you're strong.
Well, this is a first. I've never helped teach a class remote with all of you watching in on your phones. This is fantastic. I hope we don't have to do this for too many more months, but first, let me say thank you to Mayor Riley and his assistants and team for pulling this off today. There's nobody in the world I respect more than Joe Riley for a host of reasons. My first encounter with Joe was at a breakfast we had at a hotel in downtown Charleston back when he was still just planning this museum, and he got out his maps all over the table. The trouble is we never quite got through talking about the maps because everybody in the restaurant knew Joe and had to stop and say hello. But that's the day I got inspired by the mayor to get involved in this. I want to take this time, though, to just say a few words about the place you're standing. This place right here, where you are, where these 2 markers now are located, are very, very special to me. For me, it began in 1996. I was doing research for a book called Race and Reunion, The Memory of the Civil War. And I was in, of all places, the Houghton Library at Harvard. I was working in a collection of old veterans papers. And the curator came up to me and said, "You know, we got this other box of veterans material if you'd like to look at it." Long story short, they hadn't even accessioned this particular collection yet, but they got out a couple of the boxes. And it was the papers of a group of Union veterans called the Military Order of the Loyal Legion. That tended to be officer level veterans. And in the first box I opened was a file labeled First Decoration Day. And so I dove right into it because I knew that in this book on memory, I would be writing to some extent about the origins of Memorial Day, though I did not know where it started. But in this file, written on a large piece of cardboard, was a narrative, the story of which I'll tell you right now. At the bottom of that narrative, handwritten, was the name Berwick with the label New York Herald Tribune and a date. That's all I had to go on. Here was the story. It described how on May 1st, 1865, at the old Planters Racecourse, the horse track of Charleston, known then as the Washington Racecourse, it had been turned into an open-air prison during the last 8 months of the war. And approximately 265 Union soldiers were buried. They had died of exposure and disease in the infield of the racetrack. And when you look around Hampton Park today, you all know the oval roadway. Well, some variation on that oval roadway was the original horse track. At any rate, what happened was in this open air prison, these men had all died and they had all been buried in a grave site, thrown into a grave site behind the grandstand of the race course, unmarked, just a general grave site. The grandstand, if you're facing where the cars are parked there, the grandstand was right behind that. There are photographs of that grandstand. It was made of concrete. The grave site was right behind it. But when the war ended in Charleston, or when Charleston was evacuated, which was in February of 1865, most of the white people of Charleston fled the city. Not all of them, but most of them. And most of the people left in Charleston were African Americans, slaves, former slaves. And finally, when the city was evacuated, it was entered by Union troops. And the first regiment to enter Charleston was the 21st USCT, the United States Colored Troops. They marched up Meeting Street. Everybody knows Meeting Street in Charleston. And there were a variety of ceremonies held. There were ceremonies held with Union generals and ceremonies held with other local people. But the big ceremony happened on May 1st at this racetrack. Between late February and May 1st, the black folks of Charleston, along with some of the white Union soldiers and some missionary teachers, got themselves together. They went to the racetrack. They knew that this had been a terrible open-air prison. And they went behind the grandstand and they properly reburied all of those 268 Union dead. Almost all of them with no names. But they made a proper burial ground. They built a high fence all the way around it. And they built an archway, an entrance. And over that entrance archway, they painted the inscription, Martyrs of the Race Course. And on May 1st, they held a parade of approximately 10,000 people, led by several thousand black freedmen and their children, carrying armloads of flowers and singing John Brown's Body. Then they were followed. Actually, the group was separated by black women, black men, and then the Union regiments. And they all paraded around the racetrack. And as many of them as could fit into the cemetery compound behind the grandstand held a ceremony. There were 4 local black preachers who gave remarks or preached. There was a small Black children's choir that sang, and they sang, among other things, America the Beautiful, the national anthem, and a couple of old spirituals. And then the ceremony broke apart, and they went up back into the infield of the old horse track and did what most of us do on Memorial Day. They had picnics. They had a grandstand, as I recall, with about 15 different speakers. They had speeches. They had picnics. Children ran races. It was a kind of a celebration. Now, I got most of this I got some of this information from that file in that veterans collection at the Houghton Library. But that wasn't enough. And I was really worried at that point that some old veteran had sat down in the 1890s and maybe made this up. It was just too good to be true. I worried that somebody had made it up. The very day I found that, I went back to an office. I had a fellowship at that point at Harvard, and I called the Avery Research Center in Charleston. Many of you may know it. It's right over by the College of Charleston. It's a Black History Research Center, and I had good contacts there. I called them up, and I said, have you ever heard of this story? And they said, no. Well, I said, was there any Charleston newspaper publishing in the first week of May, 1865? And the guy said, oh, yes, the Courier was back printing. I said, do you have it? He says, yeah, we got it on microfilm. Well, would you have a look for me? And sure enough, he called me back about 2 hours later. He said, yeah, there's a report right here. I think he said May 5th or May 3rd. He says, yeah, there's a report here about a big ceremony in the cemetery and 4 Black preachers and a child. That's where I got the information on the children's choir and the 4 Black preachers. One thing led to another, led to another. I started digging around other places. It turns out Harper's Weekly in 1867 had an engraving of the gravesite. A reporter had gone to Charleston and seen this site and wrote a whole piece about it. And there was a lithograph of the gravesite. And one thing led to another, led to another. The point of all of this is, this was the first Memorial Day. Now, there are other places in the country who claim to have had the first Memorial Day, but they all claim 1866. There's a cemetery in Columbus, Mississippi. There's a cemetery in upstate Waterloo, New York claims it. There are 2 or 3 other places, but they all claim 1866 because that was the full year after the war and it was considered more official. But this very ritual of using flowers to decorate the graves of the war dead began right there in Hampton Park. It wasn't called Hampton Park then. It wasn't called Hampton Park until Wade Hampton during the Redeemer period after Reconstruction. But the first Memorial Day happened right there in Hampton Park because Black folk in Charleston decided they were going to commemorate as best they could the Union soldiers who died to help them become free. Now, I'll just add this, and there are many other things I could add to this, and Mayor Riley and I have participated now in, I think, at least 3 events there in Hampton Park, including the dedication of that plaque that's there in the flower bed. In 2015, April. Can you still hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. In 2015, April, Charleston hosted one of the many, but one of the very best conferences about the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. And this was about the ending of the Civil War.
Right.
And the conference was great. It was all on Friday and Saturday, and they had a whole bunch of us historians there, and we all gave our talks and lectures and so on. But on Sunday, They held a really significant event right there where you're standing. They built a little stage. I was invited to just speak for like 10 minutes about the events that had happened there in 1865. The Citadel choir, or part of your choir, came and sang. A Citadel bugler came and played taps. But the most important thing of that day was that the keynote address at that event commemorating this first Memorial Day was given by none other than Clementa Pinckney, the minister of Emmanuel AME Church and a state senator in South Carolina. I stood right next to Clementa Pinckney for that whole ceremony. Big, tall, wonderful man that he was. We actually sang from the same program. We recited a prayer from the same program. He gave a tremendous homily that afternoon that he drew from 2 Samuel. I will never forget it. One reason I remember it so well is because of the events that happened in June. And after I got the news that night in June about the massacre in Emmanuel AME, I didn't even realize that it had been Clementa Pinckney yet late that night. All I saw on television was Mayor Riley with the police chief and somebody else trying to hold a news conference. But the next morning, I got a call from friends in Charleston that said, I'm sure you've heard about all this. And I said, well, yeah, I'm hearing about it now. And then I realized it was Reverend Pinckney. And I asked my friends, this was a colleague at College of Charleston. I said, do you know if anybody videotaped that event we held out at Hampton Park back in April? Because at that point, I desperately wanted to know exactly the content of Reverend Pinckney's homily. An hour later, they called me back and they said, yes, here's a video. It's on YouTube. The full ceremony is right there on video, and I was able to watch and reconstruct Reverend Pinckney's address. He spoke from 2 Samuel in the Old Testament, the story of King David going to war with his son Absalom, and he converted that great horrible biblical story of father and son at war with one another into a metaphor of America's war of brothers, war between North and South, and war between black and white. And he converted it in his own way into a story of possible reconciliation. And in effect, in that sermon he gave that day out right there where you're standing, out in the park, he offered up himself. Pinckney did. He offered up himself as a symbol of the possible reconciliation of South Carolina. A black man born in South Carolina, elected to the state Senate, and then running one of the major churches of Charleston. He said, if I can be here, we can all reconcile. And he actually ended by quoting from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. It was a phenomenal talk. But I, like everybody else, was shocked on June 16th when I got that news about the murders in the church. Now, so that site you're standing at, for me, is going to forever be the site of the first Memorial Day and the march around the racetrack, but it's also going to be this site that Reverend Pinckney made sacred just 2 months before he was murdered. So that's in rough form the story of what happened there. I'll add one last thing. You may be wondering what happened to the graveyard. Well, I don't know all the details of that. There are a few people who know it a little better than I do now. But what happened is Charleston decided to have its version of a World's Fair in the 1880s, and they converted Hampton Park into a site of a big, gigantic fair. They tore out that gravesite. All of those 268 Union dead were removed to Beaufort, South Carolina, to the National Cemetery in Beaufort. And whenever you go to Beaufort, go to the National Cemetery. go to the rear of the cemetery, the right rear of the cemetery. There is a section there labeled the Charleston Dead. That's where they were reinterred, still with no names. And any site of that graveyard and any site of that grandstand that had originally stood there is, of course, now gone. But it really gives you something else to think about each time you either go for a run or a walk or a bike ride around Hampton Park, which I know the Citadel cadets do all the time. It gives you another story to associate with that site. And it's one of the great stories in Charleston's history that I just got blind lucky to find initially, and then a lot of other people helped me put it together. I'd be delighted to take any questions if this technology allows that.
Good. I'd ask everybody to, stay on mute unless you have a question.
David, can you read me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, thank you very much for being here and for that wonderful historic talk you just gave to all of us, and so inspiring. And I will say that Reverend Pinckney was a dear friend of mine, and I actually was the chair of the fundraising committee to raise money to build a steeple and build an elevator at Mother Manual.
Yeah.
And then Reverend Pinckney died. But the night of the shooting, I went to the church, and the South Carolina General Assembly was in session then. They had a kind of a year of the session meeting in Columbia. So I knew that Reverend Pinckney was not in Charleston because the Senate had been meeting. And so I went to the church, and all the police were around and everybody. And, we were just trying to figure out what was going on. And I had these pictures in my mind of Reverend Pinckney driving 100 miles an hour coming back from Columbia to Charleston. So I asked one of the police officers, I said, have we seen Reverend Pinckney yet? Has he arrived yet? And he said, no, Mayor Riley. Reverend Pinckney was there. And if I lived to be much older, that moment and all the moments of those few days, but just of my picture in my mind of my friend, this most amazing, energetic clergyman, going from driving at breakneck speed from the capital to Charleston to finding out that a bigot assassinated him with his 8 other church members, and he was a great man. And I think the way he was able to deliver that most powerful address here was just such a sign of what he was and the kind of person that he was. And so let me see, I've been monopolizing this device, and let's see if there are any questions of you can ask on your phone, or as one of the great historians of our time or any time, and we're so honored to have Professor Blight with us. Any questions or comments? Yeah.
Hello, sir.
Hi there. Hey, I can see you.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. So, my question is, when I read your op-ed, you mentioned how it seems like the history you said of the Confederacy caught up to the late Senator Pinckney when in the Emanuel 9 shooting. And do you think, my question is, do you think has America ever learned from what happened with the Emanuel 9? Like, I know we talked about forgiveness, and And we talk about, understanding the history of like the Confederate flag, taking it down and everything. But do you believe, has America truly, have we ever learned from when we went through almost 6 years ago? And do you think we can improve from now on moving forward?
Well, Tyler, right? It's a great question. It depends on which day we sort of have to face this, isn't it? Some days I feel like, no, we haven't learned anything. We haven't moved anywhere. I had a lot of those days during the last 4 years. But then there are other days when you think, oh, well, no, wait a minute. We have changed this. We have changed that. I will say this, horrible as it was, that horrific sacrifice that Mother Emanuel led to an initial reckoning, especially with the Confederacy, the Confederate flag, Confederate monuments, like we had never had before. There's no question about that. Everyone likes to talk about how Charlottesville in 2017 was a big turning point because of the big white supremacist march and then the person who died there and so on and so forth. And it was a big marker. But the real marker in recent history that has gotten this country at least to begin to really have a reckoning with Confederate memorials and monuments and the Confederate lost cause is what happened in Charleston. Because that summer is when the possibility, at least, of Confederate monuments being removed, replaced, relocated, and so on really took hold. And now I believe, right or wrong, people can debate this, but right or wrong, it's something like 160 odd Confederate monuments have indeed been taken down, removed, or relocated. Now, there's still a lot of them left, probably about 14 or 1500 of them left across the South and even in the North. But those events in Charleston were a true reckoning with that. In our politics, there have been times, of course, when you have to say, especially with the revival of white supremacy and the revival of right-wing hate groups and the revival of white nationalism in these past 4 years, it doesn't look like we've made progress. But here's the thing about history, as you guys are no doubt learning. Every time there's a great advance in history, or what we might define as an advance, there's always a reaction to it. Every time there's a revolution, there's always a counter-revolution. And in some ways, what we have lived through in the Trump era has been a counter-revolution against some tremendous changes that have really reshaped this country. Another way of thinking about it is that history never takes a day off. It's always happening and it's always changing. Cause and effect never take a day off. They're always happening. And, we have now at least turned some kind of corner, and we have a chance to face this past and do something about it. One of the things I love about sites like Hampton Park and the story that it can now represent is that it begins to give us not just a different angle on the Civil War, but a different angle on what it was actually all about. Those people marching on that race course in 1865 were saying with their flowers in their feet that the Civil War was about their emancipation. It was about their liberation. And by extension, it was about the liberation of the country from its past.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
You bet, Tyler. Thank you.
Good.
Any
Other questions?
Comments?
I'll just say one last thing.
Yes.
I am
David?
thrilled that these two markers are there because I first exposed this story in 2001. It took some time for South Carolina and Charleston to get Mayor Riley was always serious about this, but it took time to get a state marker there. It took time for these these confrontations with the past to take hold, but that's what the case usually is. You know, they started planning the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. about 25 years before it was actually unveiled.
Yeah.
Anyway.
David, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. Thinking back to maybe some of your earliest visits to Charleston, and then today, how have you seen the historical landscape change in Charleston?
Well, I must have first gone to Charleston when I was in my 20s, which is a long time ago. And then many times since. There was a time when very little of this story of slavery and so on, was ever told in the formal tours of Charleston, but that has really changed. And there are a lot of people responsible for that, and I'm not one of them. I'll give you one example. When I was doing research for that book, Race and Reunion, I did a lot of research at the South Carolina Historical Society, which has a great collection, by the way. And some other documents I found about the Hampton Park events, I mean, the race course events, I found in the South Carolina Historical Society. But I also visited an old historic house in Charleston. This is in the late 90s. It's called the Aiken Rhett House. Do you all know that?
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great site, and it was one of the very first antebellum. It's not a plantation house, it's an urban house, but it was built in the 1820s, and it had slave quarters out in the back in the carriage houses. But that house, as early as the 90s, was already doing a tour that had no furniture. They began their tour out in the slave quarters, where the people who had lived there were named, and you worked your way into the big house. And even in the big house, you started in the kitchen and the women who worked there, and you worked your way up. It was one of the first antebellum slave sites, if you like, that I visited back in the 90s. And I always thought it was a great model for what so many other plantation houses and so on and so forth ought to be doing. And now a lot of them do. I haven't been back to the Aiken Rhett House in a long time, but I was so impressed with that. Has to be 25 years ago that I would have first gone there. So there's been this sensibility. Oh, and by the way, there was an African-American man who worked at the Aiken Rhett House, whom I got to know. And when I found this race course story, the first Memorial Day story, he was one of the people I went to and asked a little bit later. I said, "You ever heard of this story?" Because he really knew his Charleston history. He said, "No, never heard of it. Didn't happen." But here's why nobody knew about it. Here's why nobody knew about it. The Confederate lost cause story, the lost cause ideology, and all of its stories about how they never fought for slavery and so forth. It took hold of South Carolina's memory of the Civil War with an iron fist, especially by the 1870s, in the wake of Reconstruction. There were a lot of people around who would have, in living memory, knew about this story that happened at the race course. There were 10,000 people in that parade, but no one ever talked about it until much, much, much later. It shows us a classic example about how often our knowledge of history, our memory of history can be the result of who gets to control it or who has the power to write it or exhibit it. And here's the last thing. One of the documents I found in the South Carolina Historical Society, it's priceless, and it's in my book, was that in about 1901, this is a lot later, the woman who was the head of the Charleston Ladies Memorial Association, and it was the women's groups that really ran the lost cause efforts in most towns and cities. The head of the Charleston Ladies Memorial Association writes to the woman who was the head of the New Orleans, Louisiana Memorial Society. Oh no, sorry, other way around. the woman who's the head of the New Orleans Society writes to the Charleston Society and says, we've been hearing this story about a big march on a race course, and there was a cemetery back at the end of the war. Do you know anything about this? And the woman, I have the letters, the woman who writes back from Charleston writes to this woman and says, I'm sorry, of that event, we know nothing. Now, that might have been the truth, but it might not have been the truth. It might have just been suppressed. We don't know. The point is, they didn't know about it and they didn't want to know about it. But how did they find out in New Orleans? Somebody knew the story and told it. Anyway, it's been by any measure the favorite research experience of my life was finding this event. So I'm always thrilled to talk about it.
Well, David, this is Joe again, and you know the fact is that the stories just weren't known.
Yeah.
I was born here in 1943, and I never knew this history. It was so amazingly covered up, and for me, the need for the museum is that just made me redouble or quadruple our efforts, because we just didn't know, and you know, until we know the history, we can't really move forward, and that was just a tragic after event of the Civil War, that not only it happened, but that it was hidden. And so we're, and certainly with the great historian that you are, we have the opportunity of people to help set the record straight, and hopefully we all will.
But you know, with historians, sometimes you just sit in an archive long enough, they take mercy on you and you end up finding something.
That's right.
Well, this has been fun.
Okay, well, David, you're a real gentleman, and we all know you're a scholar. They knew that before, to give us your time today. And I know that the students who assembled here will never forget it. I will never forget it. And thank you so much. And we look forward to having you in Charleston soon, and certainly when we dedicate the International African American Museum, which we expect will be sometime in July of 2022.
Well, Joe, I will be there.
Thank
I
you very
promise.
much.
You bet. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Professor Blight.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
all.